The Communion of Saints is a series that seeks to share information on the life and times of the saints of the Catholic Church. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Communion of Saints. I'm Father Jim Corda.
And I'm Father Jack Lavelle.
Now the saint we're going to talk about is Saint Fabian. Many people would not have probably ever heard of Saint Fabian, and yet there's a lot of significance about him and his life that hopefully the folks that are with us will find interesting. And one thing we'd like to mention about this series of Communion of Saints is that we just give the folks that are with us a little taste of each saint. It's not obviously an exhaustive biography of them, and many times we have just a few facts that we end up talking about, but we would encourage them to take on occasion a book of saints and read through that. Or if there's one saint that they hear about, that there's something that they really like to learn more about, just to go to the library or to Google that saint and read something about it. And hopefully we share some interesting information about Fabian today.
Well, as I reflect on the life of Fabian, and it's interesting, very few people would know much about him. Maybe they've heard more about the legend of King Arthur. And I think Fabian is kind of like the precursor to King Arthur. Just briefly, if we remember, there's this young man and he ends up, there's this search for the new king because the old king is dead. And legend has it, if you pull the sword from the stone, that's who is to be the king. And they're all fighting to do it, and no one can do it. And then here comes this young lad, and supposedly he doesn't even really know what he's doing. And he pulls the sword out of the stone, and then they start to say, "It's the king, it's the king." And then the kingdom starts. Fabian finds himself in Rome after the death of a king, or of a pope, in the year 236. Again, now remember, the church is still illegal, but that illegality doesn't mean that in the course of those nearly 300 years from the death of Jesus to the legality in 313, that there weren't emperors that were more tolerable of the faith. Each emperor would have approached it differently. And so around the time that we're talking, there's an emperor, Philip, who is more tolerable of the church, not seeking the harsh persecution that would have signified other emperors' time. What happens is this pope dies. A lot of people end up in Rome during the election of a pope. We see it to this day. You know, people crowd the courtyard and they want to wait and see what happens. Now, he was a lay person. Fabian was not a priest, not a bishop, not a deacon. He's in Rome, and there is this very strange thing that happens. A dove rests on the head of Fabian. A dove signifies peace. People saw that as a sign that this is who should be the next pope. So here's this layperson. He's in Rome. There's the death of the pope. He might not even know what is going on. All of a sudden, there's this acclamation. People around him start to discuss, look what's happened, this sign of peace, it's intervention from God. This is what's meant to be. And they start talking about the worthiness of Fabian to become the Pope. And he becomes the Pope. It's very interesting.
What's interesting, too, is that during his pontificate, it's a time of peace. Even though Philip, who was the emperor at the time, was lenient towards Christians or Christianity, it was a peaceful time. So obviously not only was the emperor okay with Christians, but other people and the pagans were okay with Christians because it was a time of peace. And isn't that interesting? Because the Bible even tells us when at the birth of Jesus, the world was at peace. You know, so there's throughout the history of our world and our church, there are those people who have come that signify peace and tranquility, and that is really what the Pope and the papacy should be about, even though we know that in the life of the church, many of the popes lived during very tumultuous times and warring times. And even in our day and age, the papacy, while in Italy they enjoy peace, many of the countries surrounding them are at war. And we know that there are hundreds of wars in our world that go on a daily basis, and how the church should stand as a opponent of war and as a sign and symbol of peace. Let's talk a little bit more about Fabian and what his life would have been like during that peaceful time, but then ultimately we know that he died a martyr.
Well, and it's true. And I think, we could credit some of that peace being, or that acceptance, not just from Philip the emperor, but from other people, the legend or the cult that would have immediately developed around how Fabian himself was elected. So even people that weren't necessarily on board with this Christian faith, you hear the story about this dove resting on his head and by acclamation and the people discussing his worthiness. And then look, it's coinciding with peace. People are very accepting during times of peace and prosperity. They might be accepting of leaders that necessarily weren't the person they voted for, the person they wanted, but then they'll say, well, times are good, and I didn't agree with everything this person did, but look, my pocketbook was full, my kids were going to school, jobs were flourishing, we weren't at war. So we find all of this, people love peace and prosperity, and they're even more tolerable of people of different denominations of faith, different ethnicities. When things start to go bad, we look for scapegoats. And so, look how horrible it is since they came to this country, or since this person got elected, or since this started to be the direction of the country. And so you go from acceptance because of peace and prosperity to the blame game because things start to decrease a little. At the same time, you have Philip who dies. The tolerance that was there is gone. There may be other factions and other things in place, but we know that the next emperor who comes in is not tolerable. And oftentimes what happens is, someone else comes in and says, well, look what's happened, so we need a complete about-face. And so it could have been, well, it's because you were tolerable of those Christians. Look what you let happen. They're taking jobs, or they're being accepted, or people are overlooking things they're doing. No more of that. And so that's ultimately what happens to Fabian. The new emperor comes in, crucifixion takes place again, other forms of death penalty because Christians fall into traps. And the same thing happens for Fabian. He's the leader of the movement. And so signified by peace, elected by peace, the proponent of peace, in the end suffers a martyr's death.
And we know that Decius, who was the emperor during that time that took over for Philip, it would be another 60 years when Christianity would finally enjoy its freedom through the Edict of Milan with Constantine. We're going to talk about another saint in just a moment, but we're going to take a quick break. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
I spent 34 years as a teacher.
For the first 10 minutes of teaching, I was terrified, and then I fell in love with it.
I am so grateful that teaching was my ministry. It was such a gift.
Many sisters, brothers, and religious order priests served for little pay.
One year, I had a classroom of 68 children.
I was chaplain for the ice hockey team and loved it, even the 6:30 a.m. practices.
Today, hundreds of religious communities lack retirement funds.
I loved helping the kids stage musicals.
Gifts to the Retirement Fund for Religious help provide for medications, nursing care, and more.
Back then, we didn't earn much, but seeing a child learn was really priceless.
Please give to those who have given a lifetime. Donate at your local parish.
Thank you, and God bless you.
There is a place where a total stranger will give you their blood. A place where someone you never knew will save your child from drowning. Where a person who doesn't look like you, talk like you, or dress like you will give you shelter after a flood. That place is called America, where we look out for each other. When you help the American Red Cross, you help America.
Welcome back to our show. Now we're going to talk about Saint Sebastian. We just finished talking about Saint Fabian. We didn't mention that his feast day was January 20th. Saint Sebastian's feast day is also January 20th, and his life and times is almost identical with Saint Fabian, and yet he was a soldier, he was a layman. So let's talk about Sebastian.
Okay. Yes, both Fabian and Sebastian live in the 3rd century. Now Fabian died in 250. Sebastian lives another 18 years. So we have to assume, being a soldier, he might even have been very young when Fabian died. But he was a soldier, and there's something interesting about soldiers and Christianity. We can look at some of the earliest moments of conversion, go back to some of the centurions, who were there and who were forced to crucify Christ. That was their job. They were, I hate to say it, but doing nothing wrong. They were carrying out this legal execution of a traitor of the state. And yet we know that familiar line from the centurion who witnesses the events of Good Friday and says, "Surely this man was the Son of God." So you see a soldier attached with the earliest opportunity of conversion from witnessing the life, death, and ultimate resurrection of Christ. It became a challenge for soldiers whose occupation was to kill, whose occupation was to take life, whose occupation really was to persecute Christians. But to find conversion would have been a great testimony to some of the lives they were taking, because they would see, and we know this to be true of many stories of soldiers who converted, they were there to put them to death, they were there to persecute them, and yet they would see love and tolerance and almost an acceptance of this martyr's death, because they wouldn't deny Christ. They would not, do whatever it took to save their life here on earth. They wouldn't denounce Christ. They wouldn't renounce his name. And so in people like Sebastian, it does something to them. It changes their whole direction, their whole openness, and their whole understanding of what this Jesus might be.
There's another dimension of the life of Sebastian that I find interesting, and that is that many people at the time did not know that he was a Christian until after his martyrdom. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering what that says, not necessarily against his life, but what does that say about us when people might say, well, I didn't know that you were a Christian, mm-hmm. or oftentimes the way that we live our life might show others that we do not espouse the Christian tenets, mm-hmm. And so there's that whole other dimension to it, that the life that we live should be such that people recognize Christ in mm-hmm. us. I go back to something, I believe it was in the New Testament, in one of Paul's writings, where they were saying, look at those Christians, see how much they love one another. Mm-hmm. That certainly would have been the example that Sebastian, as a young soldier, would have experienced and witnessed, mm-hmm. and would ultimately have accepted and understood, and whether he did that quietly or secretly, who knows? The bottom line was that he was a Christian. Mm-hmm. He ultimately was martyred for his faith. And his martyrdom, like many of these early saints, is kind of borders on the gruesome. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about that.
Okay. Well, just briefly, before we get to that, to touch on that, I don't think there's anything stopping us from bearing witness to our Christianity. But when you look at someone like him, again, it's still illegal.
Sure.
And yet he might have been in a more powerful position as a secret follower to help others, to convert others, to maybe save some lives. We hear, again, going back to the events of Good Friday, we hear of Joseph of Arimathea, a follower of the Lord, although a secret one for fear of the Jews. What good could he have been? I was thinking very quickly of a modern day example when we think of Anne Frank. The young woman named Miep, who didn't collaborate with the Germans, but she kept very private what she was doing, because if people would have found out, she herself would have died, but the whole Frank family would have. And so in secret, she brings this charity and this mercy and this love. So I think for Sebastian, it probably was the best thing for him to be able to do. We know that because as soon as it is found out that he is a Christian, he's martyred. Now, to get to the details of his martyrdom, he is shot with several arrows. There are images of him dragging along, trying to get away from them. We know that he is rescued or cared for by a fellow Christian who is a nurse, nursed back to health, and yet he is found again, found that he might live, and so this time they beat him to death. And so first the torture of the arrows, they don't claim their victim, then he's beaten to death by the order of the emperor. And why this would have been so important, not every case of Christians made their way to the emperor. The emperor is an important man. Some of them just acted out on what their basic orders were. But you don't want a soldier who defies death, who witnesses to his Christian faith. That becomes too much of the poster boy for the rebellion. For the Christian faith. And so it would have reached word to the emperor. We know that this emperor is the same one at the time who called for Fabian's death, who was not tolerable of Christians, and so he needed to make an example of Sebastian. As oftentimes happens in martyr's life, it doesn't work out ultimately the way the emperor wanted, because we have this outstanding example of martyrdom and faith.
In just the last 2 minutes of this segment, we'd like to tell the folks that are with us that perhaps if they have a son or daughter or a family member, relative or friend who is in the military that's serving our country overseas at this point, that they turn to Sebastian and pray to him for their health and well-being. And that's why the saints are there. The saints are intercessory for us. They are there to bring our prayers and our intentions to God. And so those who are serving our country in the armed forces also need protection and need prayers and guidance. And the folks that are with us that have those folks that are in that particular profession can certainly turn to Sebastian and pray through his intercession for the safety of them. We're going to talk about another saint in just a moment, another whole era, and stay with us. We'll be right back.
Whether it's passing on medicine, a blanket, or something as simple as a glass of water, that's how compassion works. And that's how Maryknoll works, hand to hand to hand. For nearly 100 years, Maryknoll's been passing on your help to the priests and brothers working in 26 countries around the world. Maryknoll, an American Catholic organization, dedicates 86 cents of every dollar donated to their programs, serving the world's poor and powerless. And that's how it works. Compassion flows from your hand to the hand of someone in need. Hand to hand to hand. That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
That's
Maryknoll.
That's
Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll.
That's Maryknoll. That's Maryknoll.
Their numbers are growing. More and more. More than a year ago. More than a decade ago. More people now living in this state than nearly any state in the Union. 1 out of every 8 people in America. 1 out of every 10 families in America. 1 out of every 6 children in America. 33 million Americans struggling just to remain standing. 33 million Americans teetering on the brink of hunger, sickness, hardship, uncertainty. 33 million Americans in these United States descending into poverty. And as their futures fall, so does our nation's.
Welcome back to our show. The final saint in this segment we're going to talk about is St. Vincent de Paul. We're very familiar with St. Vincent de Paul. Probably every parishioner around the world knows St. Vincent de Paul because he is like the symbol of charity when we talk about him. Let's try to set the scene and the stage of when he was born, what was going on at the time, and why is he so well known?
Well, he's born in 1580, so the end of the 16th century. At the age of 20, is ordained a priest in the year 1600. One of the things interesting about his life is, perhaps had some circumstances not entered into his life, he would have lived and died just a good priest, and we might never have known much about him. As it turns out, he falls into the hands of African pirates, and he is imprisoned for 2 years. Then that itself becomes a great story that's told, and yet his love and forgiveness and mercy for even his captors, and then after his release, maybe in those 2 years he also had time to reflect and pray. If he gets out of this, what does he want to do with his life? We've all had those moments, not imprisoned by African pirates, but we've all had those moments in our life when we've had a difficulty or a challenge, and we've said to ourselves, if I can get through this, what do I want to do with my life? Maybe it's a health crisis, maybe it's the loss of a loved one, maybe it's a change in our occupation, but we've all had those moments where we've had to sit down and say, if I can get past this, what do I want to do? Life's too important to waste. What do I want it to be the hallmark of? And so for St. Vincent de Paul, it's charity. That becomes the predominant virtue that guides the rest of his life. Now, it wasn't new to him, but he was given what could be seen as a second chance. Those 2 years of imprisonment, at any moment he could have been tortured and killed. But he moves beyond that, and he really wants to make a difference in the lives of the poor, the disenfranchised, the sick, the suffering, those who have no one to champion them and no one to help them. And that's really why he is so well known today.
What's interesting too, and you had briefly mentioned it, is that this was nothing new for him. He was born poor. Mm-hmm. So, like many of the saints who were born to wealth, who distributed their wealth to the poor, this is totally different. This man was born poor, probably died poor, spent his life with the poor. And so his whole existence was to serve the poor because he understood that. And I wonder how powerful it is when someone can resonate more with a particular person or group of people because they themselves have experienced that. Someone who may have been a slave might understand how to handle treatment of slaves, or someone who was born poor might resonate more quickly with people who are poor. And so there's that whole sense that his whole existence was that. We know that most, if not every, Catholic parish around the country and perhaps around the world have what they call St. Vincent de Paul societies that are primarily there to feed the poor and to clothe the poor and to basically live out the corporal works of mercy. Why and how has that become so important in the life of the Church today, especially when we talk about the pontificate of Pope Francis, who exemplifies St. Francis?
Well, I think first, with him being poor, and to kind of answer the question you posed, oftentimes we'll hear about people, especially people who make it good, that they don't forget where they came from. They don't forget their own. And not in a negative way, but people who now have the power to help the less fortunate. Those who now, whether they've risen up in employment, or they've risen up in fame and celebrity, or they've risen up in politics, to be able to go back and remember where you came from and help, not help Bill or Jim or Mary, who I remember from my street, but the people who find themselves in the same circumstance that I was once in. And I think that becomes a great clarion call for people as well. And I think that's what Vincent de Paul offers. But when you talk about the importance of the organizations and the institutions, it is important to note St. Vincent de Paul is a kind of a parallel piece within the church. It's not part of diocesan or parish structure. It's an independent organization, but working in collaboration with the church, and provides these opportunities to serve. And while there are many other charitable organizations, and even those within the church, they do focus more on the main charisms of the basic necessities of life. Feeding the poor, clothing the naked, those types of ministries. And then partnering with other institutions and organizations that might do more case management. But they really are kind of a frontline, immediate needs. You know, we need to do case management with people, but if someone's hungry, you don't say to them, well, now we're going to talk about how you found yourself in this situation and move you out of it. That's why St. Vincent de Paul, Catholic Charities, you know, we have to meet immediate needs, but then help move people out of those circumstances. But Jesus said the poor you're always going to have with you, and when we do studies and we do surveys of all the charisms of the Catholic Church, the one that the majority of people in the pews say has to hallmark the church is service to the poor.
We have about 2 minutes left of our time together. We know that St. Vincent de Paul is actually called the Apostle of Charity. And so when anyone wants to think or talk about charity or ministry to the poor, we look directly to this apostle who is St. Vincent from France. And what's interesting too is when someone is designated as an apostle, their life is really set as an example. And so that does not mean that we only had 12 apostles. Apostle is a designation of someone who has a certain ministry and purpose, and so his whole purpose was charity. When we talk at the beginning of the show about saints, we want people to get to know more about the saints, to learn more about who they were, why they are called saints. Even though they're very familiar with St. Vincent de Paul, we encourage you during those times in your church or in your parish where you are called to minister to the poor, that you do that in the spirit of St. Vincent. We'd like to thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
The Communion of Saints was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Church World Service believes that being self-reliant is a joy everyone should share. So around the block or around the world, share the joy.